thank you guys for being here. We realize that there are 10 other talks at the same time and 4 poster sessions, so the fact that you're here. And Sono Games.
Lots of competition.
So thank you for being here. We will be entertaining at the very least, I promise. Yeah.
We have some of the most unique content at Google Conference.
And you know this, so just so you know, actually this came from Sarah and I 2 years ago, talking at SAEM in New Orleans, just saying her residents had just voted to unionize and we're starting to negotiate the contract. And I'd been through it already, and so we started talking about what does this look like and how does this all feel, and that got us talking, and then we ended up creating an academic medicine article on sort of what does that look like and what, you know, the framing around it, and then that kind of launched us into the talk.
Where are you at?
I'm at Wake Forest.
Oh, wonderful.
Sweet.
Oh, you have Nicole Prendergast was with you guys. She was one of our chiefs.
Very, very happy to have her.
She's just, she's amazing. Yeah.
My resident just matched copywriter.
Oh, really? Yeah. One of our faculty is the both to Fort Mills.
Yeah, he's the faculty with him.
Yeah.
Thank you for coffee.
And where are you at?
Bridgeport, Connecticut.
Okay, nice. So,
We'll see if there's a couple more people that come, and if not, like, we did sort of a modified thing last year too, when we had a different talk also on the last day, I think also at the 8 a.m. slot. But, you know, we can make this very much, you know, like a conversation and, you know, do it in whatever, you know, we can go through, we'll go through our slides, but like in, you know, whatever way is most helpful for both of you. And it's actually mostly, it's like been like a therapy session to put this together. It's been great. Most of our meetings are just like,
yeah.
Guess what's going on right now?
And it's germane, you know, it's so germane because it's happening in a big way. So I suspect if and what's your role at Wake Forest?
So, I mean, I used to be an APD, but I'm an ultrasound director now, and I just am interested in unionization. But there's not a lot of information to be had on the interwebs except for groups that have unionized. So,
Right.
the unionization side of things, and our presidents,
Yeah.
I believe, would be able to do it. Like, I think technically the business structures are such that they would be eligible to do it. Or faculty, I don't know they can. I think that their business structure is such that they would not be eligible to. Just kind of the goods, the bads, or the new challenges would be interesting.
Yeah.
The PD at Virginia was telling me, well, she's the former PD now, but was saying that like the state law there is like that's, you know, state employees can't unionize, and that because of they're like a state entity. So there are like,
Interesting.
she was like, I don't have to worry about it. Like my residents like legally can't based off of Virginia law.
Right, and Missouri's the same way. So right to work, states right to work. So in Missouri, they can't unionize either. How about you? Are you union? Like, what's your role?
So I'm a community doc, but we fall under the Ivory Tower of Yale, so we have residents who filter for their community site.
Yeah.
But now our hospital used to be much more standalone, like we are Bridgeport, we are like we will meet her site, but that's it. But
Yeah.
we become more and more incorporated under the umbrella.
Yeah.
So now more so what the Ivory Tower decides also dictates what our plans are. So I don't know where that's heading.
Okay.
Unionizing has not been mentioned thus far,
Okay.
but I feel like as community docs, we'd be the last ones to find out, so I'm just trying to learn.
Nice.
Are you also the same where they're putting DX students for me, or is that?
I think we have some of their PAs, but not their residents.
And then Allie, where are you again? I'm sorry.
I'm at University of Virginia.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, Anita was the one that was telling me that. So is that true? I mean, is that it might not yet be on your radar as a student, but
I've heard that, yes, but I don't know for sure. She would know a lot more than I would, but that's my understanding.
yeah.
And are you a Rising Four or are you a Mashed Four?
I'm a rising four.
Awesome. Okay. And this may be very relevant to you, to be honest. In fact, you know, it's really interesting just kind of like just asking the residents and asking a little bit about, you know, if they are, you know, some programs are, some programs aren't. And it's just really interesting to kind of learn more. Good. All right, so we're gonna get started just because, like, you know, why the hell not? All right. So for those of you who don't know me, I don't think I even need that really. I'm Fiona Gallahue. I'm the founding program director for the University of Washington in Seattle. So we were accredited in 2011. I just recently stepped down in 2023 after 13 years, essentially, and still supporting the program through the end of June. Our residents voted to unionize in 2014, and our first contract was negotiated and signed in 2016. We've been through 3 contract negotiations, so come on in.
She's like immediately.
And so we've been through 3 contract negotiations. So when Sarah talked a little bit about her experience unionizing, it was a natural conversation.
Great, so I'm Sarah Krasaniak. I'm the program director at Stanford. Our residents notified us in February 2022 that they were going to unionize. We'll talk a little bit about how you learn that this is happening. It was a total surprise to all of us in GME. So February 2022, there was an election, and then we just signed a contract in December of this last year. So we're sort of right now just implementing new contract, but yeah, like 18, I think they say like 18 months is about like the timeline, so.
And I'm Dan Egan. I'm the program director at Mass General and Brigham, and our residents very much did not keep it a surprise. We're pretty transparent about the process that they were discussing unionization and voted to unionize in June, and so, in October, and so we're in about month like 5.5 or 6 of contract negotiations at this point.
Okay. So 3 different stages in the unionization process, which is, we thought was kind of a natural collection of discussions. We also want to just have a couple of disclaimers because it's obviously a charged topic, and unions are not good or bad. I actually trained in a unionized program. We do not oppose unionization. We are PDs. We come from a PD lens. 100% we are pro-resident. 100% pro-resident. And I think that's something that and part of the challenges of this is that suddenly there is this triad that occurs when there was a dyad. Part of this talk is about how do you negotiate that. We also want to be very clear that we don't represent our collective institutions. If you do not like anything you hear, talk to us. Again, because it's a charged topic, and none of us have any conflicts to disclose. Also, we represent 3 different institutions, 3 different institutional experiences. Obviously, everybody's experience will be somewhat different. All right, so as I mentioned, I actually trained in a unionized program. I trained at Bellevue, NYU. We were a unionized program under CIR. CIR is the oldest union that exists, and they developed in 1958. Other programs from that wanted to unionize, and the National Labor Relations Board in 1976 determined that private institutions, their house staff, could not unionize, that they were actually considered students primarily and not employees. So we now had 2 classes of residents. We had those in the public institutions who were allowed to unionize. We had those in the private institutions that could not. Then in 1999, the NLRB reversed that ruling and determined that all resident employees were considered, all resident physicians and house staff were considered employees, and therefore were eligible to unionize. So that has actually helped kind of power some of the conversations that we're having and what we're seeing. So here's, one of the headlines that you often see, and it's true that residents are unionizing at large volumes. So CIR represented 16,000 residents in 2019. In October of 2023, they represented 31,000. That's a huge jump. And we are seeing that momentum continue. This is a JAMA research letter that was just published talking about private institutional unionization efforts by house staff organizations. So these are all private institutions over the last decade or so. What you can see is residents and house staff residents and fellows turn out in record numbers for these votes. 2, overwhelmingly, they are voting to unionize. That's just the fact. Only 2 organizations of these many organizations, it did not pass. So it's important, and it's happening. And it's not just happening at the house staff level. We are seeing physician larger groups do this. So this isn't just a program director issue. This is going to become chairs, departments, institutional issues as well. This is an AMA survey which identified how many emergency physicians, faculty physicians, are eligible. So if you are an independent contractor or considered an employee, you would be considered capable of unionizing. Now, of course, there's also state laws, right to work states don't allow that, but just looking at their employee structure alone, just over 70% of emergency physician attendings are allowed to unionize, would be eligible to unionize. Allowed is probably the wrong word, because again, you have state organizations. Now, this is a crappy poll. I just want to say that right up front. This is Doximity, but they did survey 4,804 people and asked them if they'd be interested in unionizing. And you can see that overwhelmingly people are interested in learning more or interested in unionizing. And they also took this poll and identified what career stage people were at. The orange line is house staff, the sort of beige line is recent graduates, and the dark line is faculty. So even though we think about this as a resident movement, this is actually happening at all career stages, at least the interest in unionizing. This is an article by Brajic, who looked at 5,701 surgical residents, over 258 surgical programs. They compared residents who were unionized to those who were not. And this article basically found that the residents who were unionized definitely had some benefits. They found better housing. They were overwhelmingly increased likely to have housing stipends. They had better vacation benefits, 4 weeks compared to 2 to 3 weeks. And they had decreased rates of sexual harassment. What they did not find, and this has often been something that unions are like, you'll have less burnout, everything, your hours will be better. Well, duty hours did not change. Burnout did not change. Suicidality did not change. Mistreatment did not change. That's unfortunate. Educational environment did not change. And salary did not change. And salary is often one of the big driving factors in my own experience for at least that's often a conversation. I mean, I live in a high cost of living state. Across our own panel, when we talked about the benefits in our programs, my residents got bereavement leave, parking benefits that they didn't have, increased access to subsidized childcare. In Sarah's program, they had increased subsidization of fertility coverage. CME benefits. Our programs were interesting in CME benefits because this is often something that people promote. But what we found, our anesthesia program had $3,000 per year CME for their residents each year. Internal medicine at our program, pre-unionization, had zero. And our residents were not zero, but they saw a benefit to their CME benefits. Internal medicine got a benefit to their CME benefits. Anesthesia lost big time. So the CME benefits is mixed. And then licensing fee coverage, so step 3, state coverage. And that becomes important for residents who want to moonlight. Also, there's this article by Lynn basically talks a little bit about some of the other social benefits that they found, including that the unions were increasingly likely to advocate for things like family leave paid by the state, interpreter services and promote those, asthma trigger inspections in Boston for rental housing. Also institutional, so house staff diversity funds to increase underrepresented in medicine. When I was a resident, actually CIR paid for our ultrasound machine. We were a city hospital. We didn't have an ultrasound machine. I know I'm old. That was actually how we got our first ultrasound machine. The patient care funds also, in their article, went to like bilirubin meters for neonates. And then this is actually one of Sarah's new APDs, who just won the SAEM Education Fund for a grant for $100,000. And so he's actually studying the resident unionization study on drivers and outcomes of unions. So I think we're going to learn an awful lot more about unionization. It's going to be very interesting to learn more. So I think this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Great, and I think it actually, Sarah and I were just having a sidebar conversation. The study that Fiona showed with the surgery residents, I wonder if those results would be the same now. I do think there's been now we've got a larger cohort of people that have unionized, especially with salary. That one I think sticks out a little bit to me, that potentially that might not be the same now. I think there probably is a little bit. Our hospital, in the process of moving towards unionization, actually increased the salary and gave a $10,000 stipend. It was like an 18% raise in a year, which, you know, most of us were saying this was to try to prevent unionization, but it was definitely in response to their discussion of that. So they had a huge raise in that 1 year. So we thought we would just take you on kind of the journey of what happens from sort of first discussions to ultimately getting the contract, because it's actually quite a lengthy and involved process. So the very first part of this timeline is that there needs to be some sort of organization. And so what does that mean? So it essentially means that a group of house staff or whatever group of interest comes together and they say, hey, do we think this is something we should start talking about? Do we think there are other people that are going to share this interest and potentially want to also unionize? And so there's this period of organizing. And as you heard reflected in my colleagues, sometimes we know that that's happening, and sometimes it's a total surprise. So for us, this was very clear that this was happening. There were a number of sort of ghost Twitter accounts that started. MG, you know, Mass General likes to call itself like man's greatest hospital or something, from like the days of the House of God book or something. So there's like an, you know, a Twitter account that mimics that, which is basically just to talk about all the union stuff. And then messaging from CIR through social media, there were some demonstrations. And then this was also a time when the hospital really started to discuss their thoughts on unions. And so the hospitals often hire consulting firms to kind of come in and give them advice and have meetings and town halls and discussions with the house staff about why they do or don't think there would be benefits to a union. I've never heard of a situation where the hospital organization said, you should. Most of the time, that is the opposite. And for reasons that, you know, I think many of us in education, you know, there were a lot of discussions around the idea of having somebody between you and your program director, or mediators between the process of developing your educational curriculum and things, and that was a lot of the narrative from the hospital. The residents really obviously looking for a voice, looking for people to sort of collectively represent them. So this period, I would say lots of information sharing, unclear how valid all of the information was in one direction or another, and this went on and goes on for a period of time. And then once they feel like they've got enough momentum, then the next phase is to move into this time of gathering union cards. So in the old days, that was actually a physical card that people would sign. This became electronic, and so basically what the resident delegates, who are the people who are kind of organizing this process, are trying to convince their peers, and CIR is also involved if that's who you're working with, which is who we were, to sign cards. And basically that card says, I would like us to go towards a vote. And the lowest threshold that is required by the National Labor Relations Board is that 30% of the eligible individuals who would potentially unionize need to sign a card to say they want to go to a vote. CIR typically looks for 50% of the represented body to sign a card in order to move forward with a vote. I think that just pushes them a little bit more in the likelihood that they'll be successful. And at this point, this is actually a really pivotal time when the union, when the residents, whoever, need to decide who's going to be part of their union. So in our case, this included both residents and fellows. It's an interesting conversation in our institution because in emergency medicine, as we all know, we have both ACGME accredited fellows and non-ACGME accredited fellows who are working clinically as attendings, but currently are represented by our union, which is a very different experience for someone who's clinically working as an attending than the cardiology fellow who's, you know, doing all the work hour things and subject to an RRC. And so once they get enough cards, and they know they have enough cards, the union will ask the institution, or the organizers will ask the institution to recognize the union. Similarly, I don't know that I've ever heard of a scenario where the hospital or an organization says, absolutely, you can unionize. They almost always want it to go to a vote, and so when the hospital declines that voluntary recognition, the National Labor Relations Board will have a hearing, at which time they'll say that they've done everything appropriately, they've gathered all the appropriate data, they've verified that the cards are valid and associated with unique people who were eligible to sign a card, and then they will say, yes, it seems like you've done all the right things, you can have a vote. And then the voting is actually organized by the National Labor Relations Board, and it's typically about 30 days after that hearing takes place. And so they actually come into the campus to host that vote. And I would say that that time when we knew we were going to a vote, until the vote, was a time with lots of increased messaging. And so this was, so far in our experience, I would argue probably the one time where it felt a little bit heated. Right now, we're in the very early stages of negotiating. I anticipate things will change in the future, but this was the time when there was much more active campaigning in both directions of people trying to get residents or fellows to vote in favor of or against. So we had our vice president for education was sending out weekly newsletters to the residents. My residents never before knew who the vice president of education was, but they mentioned his name to me very routinely after that. Well, why does Kevin Tucker say this? And why is Kevin Tucker saying that? That's not true. So lots of questions, which brings up the role of program directors and faculty in this process. So we were encouraged to have dialogue, but very much in a neutral way, just to be open for questions, for feedback. If someone says, this is what I'm being told, does that seem to resonate with you? Does that seem like a benefit we could lose? What do you think will happen with conference food? Like the things that are important. What will happen to our Jeopardy sick call system? And just to sort of see what my answer would be from my understanding of the process, as opposed to potentially what they were hearing from either their peers or the union representatives. There was a large narrative about union busting, so any message given by the hospital was perceived as union busting, and that was sort of the label that was put on the institution, which is common language for organization if you kind of look at previous examples as well. And the most important thing was that we had to really stay out of, we had one little gaffe in the process where a senior faculty member asked someone if they were going to be voting. Not necessarily asking them what their position was, but are you even going to vote, which is actually not allowed. So you'll get a playbook from the hospital attorneys about what you can and cannot say during this time period, but one of those things is you can't directly inquire to somebody what their position is and or if they're going to physically go vote. But you should most definitively encourage everybody to vote, because the more people that vote, as you'll see, that actually will become important to the outcome of the process. So the election basically is held the 30 days afterwards, and what happens is the NLRB will come to your campus. There will be signs posted all over your hospitals to say, we're having a vote on this day at this time. I think it actually was over 2 days for us. They have representatives that come to your campus, and they identified, we had basically like 3-hour chunks of time in multiple different clinical sites throughout the health system where people were eligible to vote, and we had to allow a resident to step off of their clinical duty to go and vote if they had no other option to take part in that process. Obviously it would take 5 minutes, it wasn't a big deal. And the real key here, which is I think something that was new to me when I was learning about this process, is that it is actually purely a simple majority of the people who vote. So we had, whatever the number is, 1,300 people who were eligible to be voting. If 10 people showed up to vote and 6 people voted to unionize, you have a union. So it's purely just, and that was why there was a lot of messaging around this concept of like telling people to go out and vote. Because regardless of their opinion, the more people that are there, the more representative that will be, and hopefully true in terms of what the residents and the fellows actually wanted. About 90% is the number that was quoted to us during the process of votes that take place do ultimately lead to a union. And so chances are, if you're getting to the stage, that it's going to happen, and then you really need to start thinking about what's going to happen after that. And so the vote takes place, and then you enter into contract negotiations. And for us, what this means is that there is a cohort of hospital representatives and resident representatives, and then a representative from the union, who meet twice a month to have basically proposals and counter proposals. And so that process is going on for us. There are basically national law, like labor laws, about how this has to happen. These negotiations have to happen in good faith. When people allege that someone is deviating from that practice of good faith negotiation is when strikes potentially can happen. But the most important thing to know is that there is a period of time when nothing will change. And so that's what we're in right now, and it's called status quo, which feels like not a like formal word or phrase, but this is actually the legal term for what's happening. So right now, for example, I just got an email this morning, a resident who wanted to start moonlighting at a new site, which is a site in our system where some of our faculty work, but he would be the first resident to moonlight there, and it was just rejected by our VP of our service line because he said, we're in status quo, you can't add an additional new moonlighting site for a trainee at this point until we have a contract. So this resident is really upset. I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. Similarly, my residents asked me to change the conference food for this year. I can't do that because that's going to be negotiated. We were not able, we typically have voted on our sick call policy each year, whether it's going to be a payback system or not payback system. I couldn't change that this year. So anything that really relates to finances or their like HR type benefit, which would include the ability to earn extra income as a moonlighter apparently, has to remain frozen, which also means their salary. So they did not get a salary raise this year. And it'll be interesting to see, I don't know what the outcomes were with you, whether things will retroactively go back to the start date of the negotiating or their salary will become effective at the time of the contract. But right now, obviously, they still got their traditional increase for the PGY level, but they've not gotten sort of a 10% or whatever increase beyond that. And that's the process.
All right.
Happy to, by the way, if you have questions, we're happy to answer them.
Yeah. So as I said, we're pro-resident. I mean, as APDs, PDs, we just stand with the residents. Unfortunately, when you introduce this legal group into the process, the program director sometimes is seen in the middle. Residents and fellows are negotiating, the house staff are actually negotiating with the hospitals. However, residents and house staff, they often see the program director as their advocate, which is great, and they want their advocate to be super, super vocal. The problem with that is that you can actually be sued for interference. And that was something that was made very clear to all of us as residency and fellowship leadership, was that we needed to step back, that we would be found guilty of interference if we were overly vocal or overly supportive in a public way. That legal requirements make it very, very difficult for residency leadership, faculty who are pro-resident, and residents also feel let down by you not being that advocate. So that tension, that tone that happens in legal arguments, and especially around a freeze, can really lead to some challenges. And some of those challenges are pretty obvious. So here's a bulletin board basically for the University of Buffalo. And it says, the resident physicians are making below minimum wage. If you're a candidate coming out to Buffalo to take a look and you see that, well, you might have some mixed experiences. You might look at that and say, wow, these residents are underpaid. On the other hand, you might say, actually look at this, there's some advocacy happening around salary. So it can work both ways, but it really can, it certainly is something that's going to be brought up at interview. Also, in the threat of strikes, leadership is really struggling to try to figure out, how do we staff? How do we maintain safe patient care? That's really hard. And that leads to a lot of tension and a lot of anxiety and angst. And certainly our residents have done wellness days, they've done unity, there was a unity break, but we actually had a wellness day where residents were supposed to ask to have out, but there was a lot of murmuring that there would be a sick out, essentially. And so you can imagine it was hours of time trying to anticipate how we would manage that if that was the case. And as you might imagine, there's real impact to the faculty leaders. So this was actually MGH's internal medicine director, who had an open forum to have conversation with his residents, as he was asked to do by program leadership. Immediately after that, an anonymous poster, and this is actually all from NEJM, this is a perspective article that just came out a few months ago of his experience. He, as soon as he left that meeting, an anonymous poster posted on Reddit saying that there were coercive techniques, that he was threatening a loss of benefits in that meeting. Now, his own residents actually came to his aid and denied it, and he certainly didn't get into the fray, and specifically mentioned that I'm not going to get into a social media argument with an anonymous poster. He shortly after that stepped down. And in NEJM is quoted as, "People absolutely committed to residence don't want to be in the scheme anymore." And I will tell you, having been through 3 negotiations, it's really hard, and it takes a real hit on program leadership because there's an awful lot of tone and tenor that can be really harmful, and it makes a hard job really harder. I've recently talked to a number of the program directors in my own institution, many who have recently stepped down, and they did say that the tone and tenor of the conversations around negotiations actually accelerated the process of stepping down. So I do think that we need to recognize that there's impact. And at our last negotiation, the House staff negotiating technique was to not to fill out the ACGME survey. And in fact, a number of programs that year did not actually get to their 70%, which then created downstream effects of site visits and other lots and lots of work for program leadership who really then couldn't do the things that they wanted to do for advocacy of residents. So again, people absolutely committed to residents, don't want to be in this game anymore. From the NAGM, from a personal experience narrative, but it's real. So there is impact.
All right, so we wanted to transition into, it's like, what can we do as education leaders in the midst of these processes? And, you know, as Fiona mentioned at the very beginning, the whole concept of this talk and then the paper that we published in Academic Medicine this year came up at SAEM in New Orleans, where my residents had just, were in the throes of the unionization process, and I was like, I don't know what to do. I'm getting all of these mixed messages from my institution, from the union. The residents are mad at me because I am asking questions, and then I'm accused of union busting, and I was just really torn. And I wish I could tell you that I thought proactively about all of these strategies. Unfortunately, it was more in the reflection afterwards that I was like, why did all of that happen? But, you know, I really found myself in this place where, again, as a program director, you're pretty in the middle of what's going on, right? You're in the middle between the employer, which is the institution, and then the employee, which is your resident. And, you know, I just found myself confused because I thought, you know, everybody is looking at the same set of facts here, and everybody's seeing things the same numbers, but they're looking at it really differently. So take something like salary. The institution may look at the salary that your residents are getting and say, look at how great we are paying them. It's above the national average for residents. We've given them X percentage of increase every year, year over year. And so the institution is feeling like they're really doing a good job. But then you talk to the residents and they're like, I can barely afford my rent. I'm not able to go on vacation. I don't care what the numbers are. It's not great, but it's the same numbers. Another example is this idea of voice. You know, and residents say, we want a voice. We want a seat at the table. We want to be part of decisions that are being made. And the institution may point to all of the hospital committees that have residents and fellows that sit on it. But the residents say, that's not enough. Our voice isn't being heard in the way we want it to be heard. So again, as a program director, I was really feeling stuck in the middle of these. So I was a psychology major in college. I really loved social psychology and the science of understanding how people behave and how they think and why we do the things we do. So I want to introduce just 2 concepts from social psychology that, at least to me, gave me a little bit of a basis in terms of thinking about why people behave a certain way. So the one is naive realism, which is that we have this tendency to believe that the way we perceive the world is objective and impartial, and that anybody else that doesn't believe that is therefore uninformed or biased. And so, you know, that these divergent views are somehow we just need to convince them that they are wrong, and we'll just bring them over to see that everything that we're experiencing and believe is actually the real and true way. But obviously, the way we experience the world is very much influenced by our experiences, our culture, our beliefs, everything that we've been through, and it really shapes how we look at the world. I love this quote by Herb Cohen, which is that we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. And so I really think that, you know, this naive realism can make it really difficult
to understand incongruent viewpoints. And it can make it really hard for people to understand why the other side can't just get on board and see the way things are from our perspective. And this is just an example of an egocentric bias, which is, again, this tendency. There's a lot of sort of sub-theories under egocentric bias, but it's this idea that we just tend to overemphasize our own experience and our own perspective, and it often happens unconsciously. And then the second concept is this motivated reasoning, which is that we're inclined to believe whatever facts best support our own opinion. And this will be familiar to us as physicians, since this is really like confirmation bias, right? Like where we find those labs and the CTs that confirm this diagnosis that we're thinking of and may actually ignore pieces of information that refute it or suggest that there's another explanation for it. And this is really influenced by your own emotions. It's influenced by groupthink. This happens a lot, I think, again, in these highly emotional discussions that happen around unionization, because there's so much emphasis on value, like your own personal value. And I think, again, a lot of what came up for me at least was, the union would point to different things and tell their residents, you are undervalued. And that really just heightens these emotions and, creates this groupthink and then can create this confirmation bias. So they might look at an example of, a housing benefit, which in the Bay Area, they felt like wasn't adequate to help them, and they would say, look, we're not valued. They don't even care if we can afford our rent. But then, there's other pieces that do suggest value, like free healthcare with no premiums and no copays, paid vacation time. Like there are other things that can suggest that they are valued. But this motivated reasoning, again, you'll find the things that prove what you believe, which is like, we are not valued, and here are the things that prove that. Okay. So, these are a couple of the powers at play. So I wanted to talk about a couple of strategies that we can use, because we live in a world filled with biases. We live in a world where we have these unconscious biases. People may not even know that it's happening. So how do we as leaders navigate this? So there's two strategies that I think can counteract this. One is awareness. There was a study done looking at naive realism, which is, again, to believe that our perspective of the world is the one true and objective and impartial view. There's a study looking at how we can counteract that. And actually they found that just simple awareness that naive realism exists was enough to counteract it. They showed students, this wasn't a medical group of people, but they showed students an article. There was like a heated political discussion. They showed students an article about naive realism and then had them come back to the table and discuss it. And they actually found that just understanding that this exists was enough to at least have people think about maybe there is another perspective at play, even if at the end of it you ultimately come away with your own thoughts. And then the other one is self-distancing. And this is just asking someone to step away and look at this from a totally external perspective. And honestly, the PD in a lot of these, really sort of any of the education, PDs, APDs are really sort of this external third party, because we're not at the negotiating table. We don't fully, we can't talk to the residents about what they want, because that's a violation of the sort of the laws around negotiation. And so in a lot of ways, we are this neutral third party. And so asking someone to step back and just say, if you were to look at this from a totally external perspective, what do you think this would look like? How would this be? Where would you find value? Take out that other piece, but where is there value for what you do? Again, I will tell you, this is hard to do in sort of the height of things, but I see this also as a way to start to mend some of the relationship damage that does come out of the unionization process. And then I just wanted to talk about sort of four things that I think are really important to remember for all of us as we go through. It is really important to remind the residents of who you are. Again, we have this focused on PDs, but really for just faculty in a department, who you are and who you aren't. It's very simple, and I think it works well for the union to just dichotomize, the union has your back and everybody else doesn't. And it's not that simple. So I think it's really important to remind the residents, I am not voting, I'm not at the negotiation table, I'm here to support you, I am pro-resident, I'm not pro-union or pro-institution. So and it's a confusing time, right? Because they're being told all of these things. So remind them of who you are and then remind them of who you are not. I actually found that it was really important too to remind them that I don't have a financial benefit in whether they unionize or not. You know, I told them, like, I don't get a bonus if you don't unionize, I don't get a raise, I don't get, but like, I think that was really, like, they thought that I had some real other motivation in getting them to not unionize. And so these things that like seemed really clear to me, I found I had to tell them, like, at the end of this, my job is just my job. So, like, this is the same for me. I don't have anything either way, and I just want to make sure that you come out of this in a way that is going to be productive for your training. It's also really helpful to validate. You know, almost everybody will be going through this, you know, sort of in the same process for the first time. So, you know, bring your trainees together and say, like, we are in this together. I'm learning as you're learning. We're going through this together. We all want the same thing, again, which is like to maintain your training environment and make sure that you're well throughout the whole thing. Acknowledge that there are a lot of strong emotions, because there definitely are. Acknowledge that there will be times when they're upset, and again, reassure that you are here to support them through that. The other piece of this is that you have to remember that there are residents, this probably goes a little bit more into the support, but there's residents that may not want a union. And that voice can be really challenging, and that can feel really isolating for the resident that is unsure about the union or who doesn't want it. So be aware, you know, I think that the really big voices in the room are those that are pro-union and are fighting for it and bringing up all of the talking points about why it matters. But look for the ones that might be quieter, reach out to them, ask if they have questions, ask how things are going for them. I will also tell you that even the ones who are very pro-union, I have anecdotally found tend to be a little bit more like burned out and emotionally drained. And I think it's because, again, so much of, you know, the union strategy is convincing them that they are undervalued, underpaid, overworked, not appreciated. And I think those constant bombardment of messages about that is like really, really hard for residents, because you're told that all the time. Even in the negotiation process, right? There's, again, I wasn't at the table, but there's a give and take. I was part of an advisory board to our institution of program directors where they would come to us and say, hey, here's a proposal that's on the table from your perspective. What do you guys think? And I knew a little bit of the back and forth, but every time there was a counter proposal by the institution, the residents were told, see, like, they don't even want what's best for you. There was never demonstration of the giving part of it, just the taking part of it. And so it just feels like a beatdown, right? Because you're just constantly, as a resident, told they don't care about you. And so in the midst of being a busy resident and a difficult job with difficult patients, the emergency department is already stressful enough. Adding that to it was really hard. And I probably under-recognized some of the challenges that even my pro-union residents that I figured were like in a great spot were having through all of this. And then finally, your wellness matters too, whether you're faculty or a program director. Give yourself a chance to step back. Because again, for me at least too, and you know, Dan, I know you're going through this as well, but like, I was also bombarded all of the time by the residents, by, you know, there's social media accounts. We also had like union-based social media accounts, a website, an Instagram page. There were like bingo cards where residents would be like, if your PD tells you that, you know, if your PD tells you that like you might lose conference food, like you like put an X here, like there is like a lot of stuff that's really hard on program directors, and it is a hard time. So take a step back. I will tell you, like having other, again, whatever your role is, like vice chair, PD, faculty, having people at other institutions or even your own institution that are going through it, are a space, safe space to talk to, is really, really valuable, because other people have gone through it now at this point, right? With all of these programs that are unionizing, you're definitely not alone. You know, I looked for literature out there back in 2022. I was like, I don't know about, like I didn't train at a unionized program. I didn't know anything about it. And there's not a lot out there. So, and the other piece is really setting aside your pride, that this is not about you. It's really hard as a program director when your residents say like, this is not enough, and you're like, oh, I give my heart and my soul, all my time, and what do you mean it's not enough? And it's really easy to internalize it. And just remembering it's about a bigger process, it's about a bigger situation. It's not about you, and to not internalize it was also something that I found was really important. Like the machine is in motion, you are along for the ride, and I think if you can try to incorporate some of these strategies, it'll make it maybe a little bit less bumpy. So with that, we'll do a quick summary and then open it up. If anybody has questions or comments or, shared experiences, but just, it is on the rise. I think we're going to see just this exponential rise. We're all going to go through it. There is this very stepwise process. There's a lot of legal aspects to it as well. And these tensions are inevitable. Like, they're going to come up. There's a lot of strong emotions. And then there's some strategies, again, as leaders and as faculty that you can use to support your trainees, to support yourself through it as well. And also at the same time, like, not isolating your institution or your residents. All right, we'll open it up to questions or comments. Again, we're a small group, so if anyone has, specific things that you want to ask or bring up.
Just
Yes.
appreciated your comments about how much you're limited legally by being able to speak in any particular direction about the effort. And was that a real strain on really all members of the department as these things are going on?
It was definitely more of a strain on the program leaders. I would say that most of the faculty were not really touched in the same way. It definitely impacted the chair. And so, like, the chair does, like, chair meetings with the residents every, 3 times over the course of the year. And those conversations, because they're sort of frank, open-ended conversations, those were really intense. And she was really surprised by, the tone and the tenor of the conversation as well. And it really took her by surprise. So I would say definitely the chair was certainly impacted significantly, all the residency leaders, but I think me as a program director probably more so because I was definitely the face of the program. General faculty were really probably mostly untouched. At that time we didn't have any ACGME fellowships, so when our ACGME fellowship started, they were already unionized, and I think it was a little less tense. But the ACGME survey, that last round of that being a negotiating tool, I talked to so many program directors, and so many longstanding program directors stepped down shortly after that, like within the year after that, and they said that was like, it just was it was like that one straw that broke the camel's back, honestly, so.
And I will say it's a little bit different for those in like what's considered like a managerial position, so that would be your program leadership. I mean, your faculty still can't ask like, tell me what you're going to be like hoping to get out of this, but the rules are a little bit different for program leadership because you are that managerial. So there's a lot of communication that comes out about like what you can and can't say.
I would just, in the process leading up to the card signing, our chair had several meetings with the residents and very transparently was like, I don't think you should unionize. And then was encouraged to do that by the hospital. And that was before it was like legal, I guess. I chose obviously very much not to have any of those conversations. And interestingly, like the group of us as PDs all said to the hospital, we're not getting into these conversations because we are pro-resident, like it's been said a bunch of times, and we need to always be seen as pro-resident and not to come out with an opinion, and just because they need to know that we'll support them regardless of the outcome.
Yes.
Very naive question. So, Philly's these unions have been around since the 50s. I was unaware that they had such a long history. But once you unionize it, it's always unionized. They will never reverse themselves.
I haven't seen anything, actually, I mean, we've done some pretty deep digging. I haven't seen anybody kind of counter it. And I doubt we will, to be honest. I mean, because when you look, so I don't know if you saw the JAMA research article of how people show up for these votes in record numbers, and they overwhelmingly vote to unionize. So I think that it would be, that momentum I think is really hard. And as Sarah mentioned, I will say that the other thing is the pro-union folks are very, 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 very loud. And it's interesting how, so now that I've been through 3 negotiation cycles as program director, I actually had a resident who is this lovely person who basically was on the resident, was on that union in a leadership role, so that they want to have representatives for every program. And about 4 months into her tenure, she basically stepped out and she said, I'm really unhappy Like, this just, like, the conversations are really toxic, and it's really, like, making me unhappy to be in these rooms. So and I will say, like, we ended up having to really support her because she felt alone, like, in that, you know, in that sort of what she needed to do for her own wellness. So I don't think we're going to see a lot of it. I haven't found anything in the literature that says people go back.
And you can, but you essentially reverse the process. There has to be a vote to like ununionize, and that is like a ton of momentum. And again, my limited experience thus far is the people that are now upset with the union contract or what's going on is like, you know, there's certain programs that are more impacted than others. Our pathology program lost their ability to give. They were giving like a $10,000 housing benefit to residents, which I actually had no idea about. I was like, wait, you did what? But they like their residents lost that, or their current residents were grandfathered in. New residents coming into the program will no longer get that. So there are subsets of residents that do lose benefits. But again, I think remember too that like CIR is this massive, massive institution at this point, and they support all of the marketing and the events and the infrastructure to get that vote to happen. So the reversal of that is going to need to be like homegrown from within, and I think it's going to be challenging. Yeah, Laura.
Thanks for sharing all your experiences. I've heard bits and parts of them. I think from many of you over here, it's fascinating to hear them in aggregate. What did you think your experience as this process has matured? Clearly, I mean, Dan, you're sort of still in the thick of the initial emotion and rollout of and because both Fiona and Sarah, you guys are both a few years into this. How do you see that relationship with the union changing or evolving, if at all, as the initial emotion around the move is maybe dissipating or not dissipating?
I'll tell you just from my like new experiences, again, we just signed our contract in December, and I was like, phew, like we are done, we're gonna rebuild, we're gonna come back together, and that has not been the case. We are still very much in misunderstandings and miscommunications about what was and was not in the contract, and what the union and the institution interpret as sort of floor and ceiling. So we are very much still in like a high tension point, even though again, this was February 2022 that we started this, and so I don't know, and you are in a much more mature...
I've been through 3 contract negotiations, and there's ebbs and flows. So we renegotiate every 3 years. And so we went through that whole kind of like, okay, like it's gonna be so, it's gonna be smooth. And it's not been. I will say that we get an ebb when after the contract's been signed, but there's still foment of like unhappiness that especially Seattle, the cost of living continues to increase, and the salary bumps that they have gotten have not been the 16% per year, although they have gotten $10,000 housing stipends with the unionization and other things that have defrayed some of the costs of the salary. But there's always a feeling that it hasn't been enough, and the feeling of loss after the negotiation. So there's that relief is always tinged with a little dark about that. And then the negotiations start ramping up 18 months before it's being due. And so that the narrative starts kind of ramping up. And so we had 1 year where as part of that ramp up, they basically filed 5 grievances against 5 different programs. One of them was my program, and it was about scheduling. And when we sat down at the table, they couldn't tell. I was like, so I don't have any clarity. Like, is it block schedule that's not coming out early enough? Is it monthly scheduling? And they didn't even know what. Like, they had nothing to say, here's exactly what's happening, and this is, we're talking about block scheduling or monthly scheduling. It was just a negotiation tactic to basically like say we're doing stuff. And so they didn't know. But we had to pull all of this data in order to kind of demonstrate, like, here we are completely compliant with all of the requirements of the union. And it did give clarity to the GME office that the next negotiating cycle to basically be even more explicit, because at that time they said timely scheduling. And now it's 30 days with a hope for 60 days was written into the contract specifically after that grievance because of our program that was launched. So the grievances were actually just a negotiating tool. So no, it doesn't. Three negotiating cycles into it, it hasn't gotten any easier. But sometimes we have moments of breath.
Let's take one more question, yeah.
Have you noticed any spillover from resident sentiment into your faculty sentiment or murmurings of what now faculty is, their thoughts and opinions on it, not necessarily from the resident perspective, but now is it changing after faculty?
Yeah, so we actually, we have a site, it's a community site, like 30 minutes outside of Boston, and the emergency physicians there really just led the efforts, and their attending group is now unionizing. It's not going to be, it's obviously not CIR, because that's Committee for Internal Residents. So yes, I do think that is likely going to spill over, and I think within the organizational structure of the hospital, we have a PO, physician organization, but that leadership is just working in the hospital. So I've heard rumblings, I've not seen anything, but I've heard people saying maybe we should also, because I think there's this desire to have a collective voice. I did want to just point out one little nuance which I learned in this process, which not related to sort of retracting it, but so everybody gets represented by the union, but not every resident has to join the union. So you can opt out of joining the union. You pay, instead of 1.6% of your salary a year, you pay 1.4, but you're still represented by the union. So you just don't get access to some of their benefits, but it's like if you live in a state, you voted for the Democratic or Republican senator, but the other person gets elected, they still represent you in Congress, even though you didn't vote for them. It's like sort of the analogy that we were given to describe that. So some people can opt not to be a member of the union, but they still, because they're in that work group, still get represented by the union. So it's an interesting, weird nuance. They're saving 0.2% of their salary. I can't really feel what the benefit is for that, but some people will opt out.
And we're at time. I want to just make sure whoever's lecturing, are you guys lecturing next, Andy, in this? Yeah, you guys are lecturing next. Perfect. So we're happy to take more questions up front, but I do want to make sure we turn the room over to the next group. So thank you all for the questions and the engagement. And I'm happy to answer any other questions that you might have. Thank you.